having finished the Liana K videos, and that's it. I'm not touching that again. That's done. Finished. I noticed, having been cued by her, that I talk quite a bit about radical feminists specifically. Can we stop blaming the radical feminists for everything? Because that's what the feminists want us to do. The feminists that don't identify as radical feminists, and very few of them do, would like us to be radical feminists. It's quite easy for them to say, oh, that's the radical feminists. Or as Liana K is always saying, those are the Dorksiders. Alright, let's talk about, firstly, what is wrong with the radical feminists specifically, and then expand it out and talk about what else is wrong with the other groups. Actually, there's some pros and cons to the radical feminist. When we say radical, we mean devout, following it through to the letter and wanting some sort of revolutionary change. Having revolutionary change is part of radical. But also they follow things through to the letter. The most negative thing about radical feminists is their attitudes to sex. Because they interpret everything in society as men having all the power and using that power to dominate women, that's how they interpret sex. So, and when I say sex, I'm not just talking about the act itself, I'm talking about all the ritual and ceremony that goes around it, including things like flirting and men being the initiators. So when they see a man chatting up a woman, they see him as feeling that he has the right to invade her personal space, for example, or to interrupt her privacy, rather than the fact that actually he is the one risking rejection. He's the one taking the risk. He's the one making himself vulnerable. They can't see any of that because they interpret everything in society as being men abusing their power against women. And we can see that sex negativity spreads out to their interpretation of pornography as being violent, even when it isn't. With the ironic point of view that Gloria Steinem thinks that pornography, which is for men, is violent, but erotica, which is for women, is all about love. I don't think she's aware that 50 Shades of Grey happened. Erotic literature has more depictions of domination in sex than pornography does. Pornography is generally enticing. And the reason pornography is enticing is because it's for men. So it's full of women that are saying, hey, I want it. Whereas erotic fiction, I mean, Gloria Steinem is right, it does tend to be literature, erotic literature does tend to be for women. And because it's for women, it's full of men saying, hey, I want it. And the way men show that they want it is by being very, very active in pursuing it. Erotica designed for women tends to be full of men that are domineering, whereas pornography for men tends to be full of women that are enticing. Their negative attitudes to sex is the biggest problem with radical feminists. But the positive thing about radical feminists is they're consistent. They're consistent. Any inequality they look at that and they see, oh, that's an inequality that disadvantages me in some way, so I should be against it. Which means that men often get incidental benefits from radical feminism that they don't get from the second group I'm going to talk about, choice feminists. Now, choice feminists can pick and choose. They've decided that's their right to pick and choose. And that means that when they see an inequality that disadvantages them, they're against it, obviously. But if they see an inequality that disadvantages men, they're happy with that. They'll keep that. They like that inequality, and they get to pick and choose. And they get to pick and choose because they're the ones that are oppressed from their point of view. So they're the ones that get the right to pick and choose. Men don't. Men don't get the right to pick and choose. So choice feminists actually offer men a poorer deal than the radical feminists do. Now, the third group that are generally not considered radicals are the intersectional feminists. Now, intersectional feminism had perpetuated patriarchy theory when it was already looking a bit ragged. When patriarchy theory looked like it might have to be abandoned because it obviously wasn't making predictions about the real world, intersectional feminism came along and allowed patriarchy theory to continue. It's like how Freud, quite early on in developing the theory of psychoanalysis, believed that if a repressed memory was uncovered, the symptoms would go away. And then later, he went back and altered the sentence to the symptoms might go away because he'd experienced times when it didn't. And rather than abandon that as a theory, he just twiddled it a little bit and said might rather than will. It's a way of perpetuating patriarchy theory. And it came about because the black feminists were hearing from the feminists that men were the oppressors and they were the oppressed. And they were also hearing from the likes of Robin Morgan that men can't be oppressed. And they were thinking, well, my husband's black, so he's definitely oppressed. And then intersectionalism came along. At the moment when patriarchal theory should have been challenged, intersectional feminism came along and allowed it to be perpetuated. And what it does is it divides society against another minority. It's a minority made up of the majorities. Initially, of course, it's white heterosexual men. Obviously, there's the cis versus trans thing, but really trans are such a minority anyway. That's not really a big issue, except it may incentivize non-trans to identify as trans, which is a potential problem. I say it's not a big issue. I think that's the biggest problem with the trans versus cis thing, is it's forced feminism to revert to gender essentialism, because the social constructivism that feminism used to be based on is in direct contradiction with the premise upon which trans people self-identify. And in terms of a theoretical basis, that produces a serious dissonance that can't be addressed philosophically without somebody getting offended. What it has created is people finding new ways, new intersections to mean that they're not part of this minority made up of the majority. That's going to get mad in the end. But what it will all dwindle down to, even if you add in all these things about people saying, oh, I'm gender fluid, or as I was saying to the Anna Kay, if you had geeks versus jocks intersection in there as well, what you'd eventually wind up with is a dwindling minority which is made up of the most conforming men, the men that are most conforming to their role. How's conformity and power supposed to be correlated? That's a bizarre idea, isn't it? That the most powerful people in society would be the most conforming. It's a very strange idea. You'd think the most conforming people in society would be the most unliberated, wouldn't you? Right, okay, so radical feminists, choice feminists, intersectional feminists all identify as feminists. The next three groups might not identify as feminists, although they may be feminists. So there's a thing called maternal feminism that came about in the 19th century. But really, this is based on the traditional idea that women are men's male superiors. I say it's maternal feminism. Some of them may have identified as feminists. The women's Christian temperance movement was part of this maternal feminism, really. And it's basically carrying forward the idea that women are men's moral superiors. But they may also, being maternal feminists, they may also think women should be stay at home and look after children. They may be traditionalists. These tend to be the women that watch Oprah Winfrey. That's a bit of a generalisation, but anyway. Very dangerous combination to think that you are the moral superiors and you've also been kept in a subservient position throughout history. So, female supremacists are those that keep hold of the idea that women are morally superior to men. The idea that women are moral superiors to men can only be perpetuated by making women powerless. Women only maintain their position of moral superiority by also maintaining the position of having no agency, because otherwise they'd be accountable for their own actions. If they're accountable for their own actions, they would have to acknowledge that they're not morally pure. They're morally complex, like we all are. When female supremacists are also feminists, i.e. they also believe patriarchy theory, that is a very dangerous combination, because it means that they think not only are they superior, but their inferiors have power over them due to some injustice, which clearly is the seeds of a fascistic worldview. Next group, fragile women. When I say fragile women, I don't mean women that are actually genuinely fragile, but women that have been brought up to see themselves as fragile and have been treated as if they are fragile, and as a consequence aren't prepared for the real world. And when they get into the real world and they find that it's a world they can't cope with, if they are also feminists, or even if they just believe feminist propaganda, they blame men. And they feel the threat is coming from men. They don't see the problem as being a problem with their hypersensitivity, their fragility. They see the problem as being a problem that is out there in the world. A traditionalist fragile woman will want men to rescue her, but a feminist fragile woman sees men as the people to blame, the people to hold accountable. But either way, fragile women are a problem. Feminists. This is the last group, and I think this is probably quite an important one, is whether we identify as feminists or not, we live in a world in which we are constantly informed about the nature of men by feminists. And they won't be telling us they're feminists when they inform us. As I say, the history books, if you look at your children's history books, they will have a section on every age to say how women were treated in that age, and it will be negative. It will be about what an awful life women had during that age. The majority of men would have an awful life throughout most of the ages of history. For example, if they're looking at the Middle Ages, they won't be talking about how Catherine of Aragon was a great tactician, rivaling Henry VIII. She was a better tactician than Henry VIII. They won't be talking about that for two reasons, of course. One is the fact that part of the belief in female moral superiority wants to ignore the fact that women can be warmongers too, and also they'd rather concentrate on women's suffering. So they'll have a section on the scold's bridle. Scold's bridle was a punishment for gossips. It was a headgear, hold the tongue. I mean, it was a nasty piece of torture. And it was a punishment for gossips and scolds. But if she was a gossip, it may well have been that the victims of a gossip would have been women too. This wasn't a punishment devised because that society hated women. Worst punishment available in that society was being hung, drawn and quartered, which was a punishment only men could receive. The classic example of this effect is the way we look at the Salem witch trials, and the image we have in our heads from reading the history books is there's all these male judges and they are sending women to be hanged. If we actually look at the facts about Salem witch trials, not everyone who was hanged were women. 8 out of 24, 1/3 of those killed in the Salem witch trials were men. However, all of the victims, all of the complainants in the Salem witch trials were women. So all the executions that happened in the Salem witch trials were done defending women, in defence of women. So rather than the Salem witch trials being an example of misogyny, quite the opposite. It was an atrocity that was founded in gynocentrism. The way we have propaganda about our history is rather the way we have propaganda about the Islamic world. And we keep seeing images of women getting executed or stoned. But if you look at the statistics, the number of men getting executed exceeds the number of women by at least 100 times. By comparison, there's about 1 in 3 victims of domestic violence are men, and 1 in 3 witches killed at Salem were men, as it turned out. I just discovered today. When we're talking about people being executed in the Middle East, 1 in 100 are women. 1 in 100. And yet that's the section we concentrate on. That's the one we keep getting told about in the media. If you looked at our depictions of their executions, you'd think that it was a disproportionate number of women. So it's almost like we're having that same propaganda about our own history. We've been taught to hate our ancestors in the same way as we've been taught to hate people of other cultures, because the information we get is concentrating on women's suffering and an ignorance of men's suffering, effectively perpetuating the pedestalization of women as being morally pure and the pedestalization of men as being invulnerable. We ignore the vulnerability of men throughout history and ignore the power of women throughout history. Now, clearly, if you have that kind of information we're given in history books, which does not appear on first sight to be an op-ed in The Guardian, but rather a set of facts that have been delivered to you, but much like the news media is picking and choosing which facts to tell you, so your history books are picking and choosing which facts to tell you. You don't have to be a feminist to believe that women are the ones who have been helpless and suffered throughout history, whereas men have been the ones who have been powerful and inflicting suffering throughout history. You don't have to be a feminist to believe that. You just have to take the history books that you see when you're at school at face value, rather than investigating them, and rather than investigating the facts behind them. You don't have to be a feminist to believe that 1 in 4 women on campuses are raped. You see that statistic everywhere. And because it is a statistic, you believe it, because statistics seem real, they seem tangible, they're numbers. This is a pedestalization of maths in a way. We believe numbers more than we believe words. But numbers can be just as manipulative. And statistics is just the mathematical branch of rhetoric. But if you believe that figure, you're going to fear men. If you don't investigate where that figure has come from, what that figure actually represents, it doesn't even represent rapes, even if you take Mary Koss's study at face value. If you take Mary Koss's study at face value, it actually is supposed to represent rapes or attempted rapes, even before you look at the methodological problems with Mary Koss's study and how what figures were derived from it may have not represented the facts. Even the finding itself is misrepresented in the rhetoric. But you hear that repeated enough, you're going to believe it. And if you believe it, you're going to fear men. You don't have to be a feminist to fear men. You just have to believe that what they tell you as fact is factual. 4 biggest problems we face. 1 is the assumption of female moral superiority. Secondly, being brought up as if they are fragile and consequently seeing themselves as fragile. 3, women not being the masters of their own fear. And 4, women's lack of skepticism. So as you can see, those are 4 traditional feminine traits. They're 4 traits that are considered to be feminine based on traditional gender roles. So we're talking about roles that have been engendered, quite literally, in women by traditional upbringing. So, not surprisingly, the solutions to them all is engendering certain masculine traits. And they are, firstly, skepticism. In the same way as men are brought up to be skeptical, women should be brought up to be skeptical. None of this believing in intuition nonsense. Be skeptical, especially when people are lying to you, and the media is lying to you, when even your own history books are lying to you. Secondly, they must be brought up not to be subjects to their fears. They must be brought up to be courageous, like boys are brought up to be courageous. Thirdly, girls must not be brought up as if they are fragile and therefore learn to see themselves as fragile. They should be brought up to be resilient, just like boys are brought up to be resilient. Fourthly, moral humility, acknowledging that one has moral flaws and being aware of them. I'm assuming that you're morally superior to anyone else. I just know that, well, I know that my audience currently is all male, and they're going to go, oh yeah, I'm arguing together, yeah, we should be all morally humble. If a woman comes along, they go, men are humble. Actually, about morality, we are. The thing that we're not humble about is about achievements. That's you're talking about men that are braggarts. Men that are braggarts are like women who wear too much makeup. It's not because they believe it, it's because they know it makes them attractive to you. So, a braggart is the male equivalent of a woman who wears too much makeup. Which just makes me think that when you hear traditionalists claim that the problem with feminism is it's taught women to act like men, I have to say, firstly, you couldn't be further from the truth. The problem with feminism is it's taught women to act more like women. And secondly, for you to think that the problem with feminism is it makes women act like men is a misandrous point of view. It means that you too, just like the feminists, think there's something wrong with masculinity. There are very noble traits that consider to be masculine, and they're traits that every human being should aspire to have. The problem isn't radical feminism, it's toxic femininity. It's not just toxic femininity, is it? It's men who are supportive of toxic femininity. It's men who think it's okay. And it's also men that put women in those roles. I'm talking about your white knights. Your white knights. They instill toxic femininity in women. They not only they instill it, they encourage it. And they encourage it because it flatters them, makes them feel important. They like to be protectors, and they like to feel powerful. Tell you what, I'm going to read you something. I'll read you some Sasha Massock. Sasha Massock wrote Venus in Person. Woman, as nature has created her, and as man at present is educating her, is man's enemy. She can only be his slave or his despot, but never his companion. This she can only become when she has the same rights as he has, as equal in education and work. At present we have only the choice of being hammer or anvil. I was the kind of donkey who let a woman make a slave of him. Do you understand? The moral of the tale is this: whoever allows himself to be whipped deserves to be whipped. Now, I was just thinking about that because I suppose he's a Wollstonecraftian type feminist, really. And who allows himself to be whipped deserves to be whipped. None of this would have happened if we had been prepared to stand up for ourselves. But we hadn't. Because our instinct was to stand up for her. If we keep telling women they are moral superiors and treating them like they are moral superiors, of course they're going to believe they are moral superiors. If we keep treating them like they're fragile, of course they're going to believe they're fragile. If we keep acting like heroes for women, of course they're going to be cowards. It's because of white knights that the feminists that have been most successful and have become most powerful are the ones that flattered him most, that made him feel most powerful and most like a protector. That's the feminism that got rewarded. That's the feminism that got encouraged. And that's why we found out the feminism we have now. I'm going to add to the idea of white knights. The other type of men with a problem are proud pack horses. They're the ones that are very proud of the burden they bear. And that can be the burden of guilt even. Because that feeling of guilt makes them feel self-righteous. They're a problem as well. These are the ones that will defend feminism to the hilt. Because the very fact that feminism makes them feel guilty gives them something to feel proud of. They feel proud of the weight of guilt upon their shoulders. And that's why they support the most misandrous feminism around. Proud pack horses don't want to hear that it's as bad for them or as worse for them than it is for women, because that might alleviate some of their burden. You take the burden off them, you shame them. They take great pride in the burden they bear. Of course, because I am a skeptic, there's only one blind man reporting the nature of elephants. Other opinions are available. Cheerio. The three biggest things we've got to worry about. 4. It's going to be like the police badge position, isn't it? Now, I would say that skepticism, courage, moral responsibility, which is actually the opposite of moral superiority. To be morally responsible, one must be aware of one's own flaws. And I've got these two around the wrong way. Resilience. Okay, the opposite, right. So what did we establish? Forgotten now. Oh, I've got lost. I've got lost, haven't I?